Good afternoon, everyone. Today's speaker, Katalin Picu, received his PhD from Dartmouth College, Thayer School actually, and then spent 3 years at Brown University as a postdoctoral research associate. He became assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical, Aerospace, and Nuclear Engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 1998, and he's currently professor in the same department. He published 2 books and over 100 journal articles and book chapters, and he's also a fellow of the ASME. Please welcome Katalin.
I'm supposed to push a button here. Does it work?
Let me see if we can make that work.
It works, I think.
Does it flash green? Yes, you're good.
All right. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, and in particular thanking Professor Francis Kennedy, who invited me, also for his mentoring and friendship, I dare to say, over the years. This is a special occasion for me. It's not just a homecoming event, but it's also a personal celebration, so to speak, because in less than 2 months, there will be exactly 20 years since I stepped through, for the first time, through the doors of Thayer School of Engineering. 20 years in this area. Actually, never mind. The reality is that I just figured that you are looking for a new president, so I thought it's a good moment to visit you. But I forgot my special glasses, for the YouTube show. But anyway, never mind. All right, so I will try to show you some of the results we have obtained and some of the problems we have been working on. And in order to keep with the nature of this seminar series, I will try to actually emphasize not only the science component, that is the take-home message that needs to be provided in any talk of this nature, but also emphasize the impact that this activity, this research activity, has on developing new products and on society in general. So this is a summary slide presenting the various problems we have been working on over the years. Quite different topics, in fact. I would like to spend the beginning of this presentation by reviewing some of these topics, in particular the 3 which are listed on the upper right corner. So is there a pointer? All right, I can use my mouse. So we worked on problems in plasticity, dislocation mechanics, dealing primarily with the physical origins of rate sensitivity, why materials deform in different ways or require different stresses when you deform them faster or slower. We worked on homogenization techniques, essentially looking at how microstructure of materials affects macroscopic properties, and in particular looking at specific types of microstructures which in fact have not been yet synthesized, but we are investigating them for the purpose of determining whether we can actually indicate what types of microstructures are desirable for certain applications, for certain macroscopic properties. Thank you. Other topics such as molecular crystals, we are doing work here related to pharmaceuticals and energetic materials, that is explosives. Also DNA crystals, so I'm going to show you a few things about it. Polymer nanocomposites and some other work done on the nanoscale. So let me show you a few things to begin with about some of these subjects. I picked these examples because they indicate how nanotechnology can be used to develop new materials with new properties and which presumably will have some impact on society in general. So let's talk about polymer nanocomposites first. Polymer nanocomposites is today a very broad area. You are talking about mixing pretty much any polymer you can come up with pretty much any nanofiller you can consider. We have been looking at a number of this, thermoplastics mixed with carbon nanotubes and with nanoparticles and such. But I would like to tell you a little bit about epoxy-based nanocomposites. So why epoxy? Well, epoxy is essentially a glue. You can look at it this way. It is a cross-linked molecular network. It is being used in a variety of applications. For example, for the purpose of making composites, you would embed, let's say, fibers like fiberglass in epoxy, compress everything, and cure, and you get composites of the types that we use almost every day. These helicopter blades are actually an example of that. These blades used in wind turbines can be also made from materials of this type, and somewhat surprisingly, at least for me, epoxy is also used in civil engineering applications, probably not in the Golden Gate though, but in bridges too. So here is another example which I found particularly interesting. The famous accident in Boston, the collapse of the roof of the tunnel, has been actually assigned and eventually traced to failure of an epoxy adhesive. So what you see over here are these failed linkers to the roof of the tunnel. That led to, of course, some material damage, but also to loss of life. So why did it fail? It failed because fatigue and primarily because creep. So we try to, in our research, we try to improve these two properties by adding inclusions, by adding nanoscale additives to epoxy. So here is what, these are some two results which I would like to share with you. We produce these composites by mixing epoxy with carbon nanotubes, with graphene, with functionalized graphene and carbon nanotubes, all right? And then we test their properties. We test the fatigue properties and creep properties. This plot over here on the right-hand side shows you creep strain of a epoxy graphene composite versus time. So it shows the red curve shows neat epoxy, and the white curve shows the behavior of the composite, graphene epoxy. And you see what happens at room temperature. There is not much difference between them, but as the temperature goes up, then the field epoxy, this curve actually does better, in the sense that the creep strain is smaller. So this material creeps less. It is interesting that actually it creeps less at higher stresses and at higher temperatures, that is under conditions which are more demanding than room temperature. Another example is how these materials behave under fatigue conditions. Now, we did two types of tests, two types of materials actually that have been developed. One in which we mix epoxy with carbon nanotubes, pristine carbon nanotubes, and another one in which we mix epoxy with carbon nanotubes functionalized with amine. Now, amine is the cross-linker in epoxy. Okay? So epoxy, as I said before, is a molecular network in which the chains are actually bonded together, cross-linked with small groups or from this molecular class, right, with amine groups. And we functionalize the carbon nanotubes with that cross-linker. So they presumably stick better to the matrix. Okay? Now, what happens is something surprising, in fact. You can put a crack in this material, and you propagate the crack. You stop the test before the specimen fails, and you look very close to the crack tip. In the first material, that is when we use carbon nanotubes without functionalization, what you observe is that the tubes are just sticking out from the crack surface. What you see here is the lower crack face, this is the upper crack face, and you see these carbon nanotubes actually sort of trying to bridge the two faces of the crack. They give some toughness, of course, because crack bridging, because they link the two faces of the crack, but not that much. Now, when you use the other type of carbon nanotubes, the tubes which have been functionalized with amine, the behavior changes completely. This picture shows again the lower crack face, the upper crack face, but in between, you don't see carbon nanotubes. You actually see fibrils of epoxy. Now, these fibrils will deform a lot. They will deform by like 400%, okay? So extremely ductile. Their dimensions are on the order of 5 to 10 microns, all right? Epoxy does not do that on the macroscopic scale. If you take a big chunk of epoxy and you try to break it, it's going to be brittle, okay? On the small scales, however, it produces this phenomenon which in other polymers, in thermoplastics, is called crazing, okay? So the presence of these inclusions actually changes the nature of failure and the physics of the formation of this material. So you get a much tougher material which actually resists more to fatigue, and this is shown in this plot. This axis represents crack growth rate, DADN, right? The speed at which crack grows, and the horizontal axis is the stress intensity factor amplitude, that is how much you load the crack, okay? So as you load more, of course the speed goes up. But look at this difference. This blue curve corresponds to pure epoxy. This is how fast cracks grow in pure epoxy. When you consider this material, the one that in which physics is being changed, you get the red curve. So you see, you get an order of magnitude improvement in fatigue properties just by adding 0.1% by weight of nanoadditives. Okay. Another example of how nanotechnology can be used for material improvement. Some time ago, we started growing nanostructures for actually trying to test material properties in very small volumes. We were looking for something quite different than what I'm going to describe now. So the starting point and the hope was one, but as we made progress in that direction, actually we ended up taking a different path and got a different result, which I think is interesting. So here are the nanostructures I'm talking about. You have a substrate, silicon in this case, and then you grow these rods. The diameter is about 100 to 200 nanometers. The length is microns. You can grow them as long as you want. They are regularly arranged, and you see that one is darker, the other one is lighter, which means that the darker one is behind. It's in another plane behind the plane of the picture. You can grow actually this spiral type of nanorods as well. Now, let's talk about thin films. Growing thin films with something very common in the microelectronics industry, right? But growing metallic thin films actually poses a big problem because stresses develop as the thickness increases, okay? These are both thermal stresses, but also growth stresses. That is, it's an intrinsic phenomenon you cannot really get rid of as you grow the film. If the energy stored in this growing film becomes large enough, the energy is going to be released by some mechanism, and usually what happens is the film buckles off. So you end up with something like this. This is a top view of a buckled tungsten film. Okay? And you notice that it has buckled when the film is really thin, about 240 nanometers in thickness. Okay? So these are really, really thin films. You would like to grow thicker ones. Tungsten is being used, for example, in ICs as barriers for diffusion of copper into silicon, right? Copper is the actual interconnect which is being used. So you put tungsten down to actually prevent diffusion of copper into the silicon. So how do you prevent this buckling? So we came up with the idea of actually using nanostructures for that purpose. So what we did is consider a silicon substrate, grow a layer of nanostructures, which you can't really see over here. You grow a layer of this type of structures on the silicon. Then you just rotate the source, and you keep growing. By the way, the nanostructures are from tungsten as well. You rotate the source, and you keep growing normal film. Okay? You grow for about 200 nanometers. Everything is stable. Then you rotate the source, and you grow nanostructures, another layer over here, and then you grow normal film, and another layer of nanostructures, and another layer of normal film. And after more than a micron and a half, the film is still stable. So basically, the presence of that layer of nanostructures in between is actually releasing the stress somehow. It's a compliant layer which is releasing the stress. So you can grow stable films without much technological new requirements from the technology side. The last example I want to show you before the feature presentation is about molecular crystals. In particular, I want to just show you this type of crystals also because they are being developed for the purpose of being used in self-assembly in nanotechnology. These are DNA crystals. What you see over here on the right-hand side is a top view of such a crystal. Each one of these strands is actually a double-strand DNA, right? They are connected in this triangular structure, and you see that this really light triangle is actually on the top plane. We are looking closer to us, so to speak. Then you have the next triangle, which is a little bit darker, and then a really dark triangle over here, meaning that they are staggered in the third direction. Okay, so it's a three-dimensional structure with this triangular type of arrangement. They are obtained by self-assembly in a wet situation. They self-assemble, essentially you start with double strands of DNA, and they self-assemble because the ends of these double strands are free. You call them sticky ends, okay? So you actually have base pairs which are not paired with anything at the end of the strand, okay? Then this base pair at the end of this strand is gonna look for a pair that matches from another strand, right? So they diffuse around until they find each other, and then they stick, okay? So after this process completes, you end up with a three-dimensional structure of this sort. It turns out that these structures are fairly brittle. The question is why they are brittle. So we set up to investigate the strength of these sticky ends. Okay? It's a molecular process by which they disassemble and the molecular process by which they assemble. So we are running molecular simulations to look at how much force is needed to stretch a DNA with sticky ends, that is 2 DNAs paired together through a sticky end, versus how much force is needed to stretch to failure a double-strand DNA, and this is what is shown over here. So these are just a few highlights from this activity targeting applications of nanotechnology in technology and ultimately in society. So for the remaining maybe 30 minutes or so of the talk, I will show you some results about fiber networks. So the question is, why fiber networks? Well, because fiber networks are, in fact, very common in everyday life, more common than we think, both in man-made devices and materials, as well as in biological materials. So let me give you some really common examples. This is one, okay? Toilet paper, absorbent paper, tissue of any sort, okay? You would think it is a really simple system. Well, not that simple. So paper is, in general speaking, made from cellulosic fibers, which are being pressed together. This structure, what you see over here, is actually an SEM of regular paper. It may be impregnated with various types of things like polymeric materials, or it may be simply pressed to form hydrogen bonds between fibers, and then they hold together more or less and give you commercial paper. Okay. It turns out that the technology involved in producing this type of material, all right, not the paper used for writing, but this type of paper, is actually quite complicated and very interesting. It happens that I had a collaboration with Procter & Gamble that ran for many years now, and in the first visit I made over there, I had this preconception that what is the big deal about papers and the other fiber-based products they are making. And after that visit, I started changing my mind with respect to that. It turns out, just to give you an example, it turns out that this type of paper is made, first of all, by stacking up several layers, which are bonded together by pressing with hot punches in a pattern that you can actually distinguish on the top of the paper, right? You see that pattern that's not laid down just for aesthetic purposes. It is actually the thing that's bonding the various layers of paper. Why do they layer it? For absorbance, in order to increase absorbance, all right? There is one more detail that I can tell you. In order to make the paper fluffy, also to increase absorbance, there is a very high strain rate process in which cellulosic fibers, which are laid down on, let's say, a plate, are being scrapped at very high rates by a blade, a sharp blade, which is literally just puffing out the paper, okay? And then this thing goes on and is being pressed together to form, not pressed together, I'm sorry, bonded together at various points to form the actual commercial product. How about this one? Familiar sight for some of us. You would say that diapers are simple. In the end, it's 20 cents a piece. But to actually produce this thing for 20 cents and make profit out of it, it's a huge thing, okay? So let me show you a clean one. That's a tube view of it. Of course, the main material over here is the absorbent material, which is either cellulosic or of some other nature. The absorbent material is covered by a very thin fiber-based sheet, which is made from polyolefins, polypropylene, polyethylene. You can barely see it. The purpose of that layer is to actually give you the feel that the thing is dry, even when the absorbent material is actually filled with things, okay? Which is amazing. Think of it. The thickness of this layer is really, really small, okay? And you put your hand on it, it looks like it's a dry thing. Another impressive component is this elastic band. It's essentially the belt, okay? The belt is made from a few layers of film, polymeric film. But they developed a proprietary procedure by which they put in place these openings, so to speak. The purpose of those is to make the belt elastic. Okay, you see, it's extremely simple, but you've got to have the idea. Okay, I can't really tell you how it works, but you can probably figure this out by yourself if you look really close. Most of everything else is also fiber network. This is the other face of the product. It's also made from polypropylene fibers, fiber networks stacked together. You probably barely see a pattern over here. those little circles are actually not holes. Their purpose is not to increase permeation. Their purpose is to actually hold these things together. Okay, so they are bonds, in fact. So the message I'm trying to convey here is this is a fairly complex product, highly engineered. You have to use the cheapest materials possible because you want to make profit out of 20 cents a piece. Okay? And the amount of engineering, imagination, and intelligence that goes into something like this, it's really impressive. All right, from the biological world, 2 examples. People are trying to grow artificial tissue by using tissue scaffolds, essentially polymeric fiber networks on which cells are seeded. All right, here you see an electrospun polymeric network used for this purpose. And here you see the green part is actually a collagen gel. This is coming from our collaborators from UPenn, on which they have a neuron sitting. Why is mechanics important in this? Well, if you seed a cell on this network, the cell is going to try to talk to the neighboring cells. It doesn't really talk through chemical clues if they are far away. It will try to talk through mechanical stimuli. The mechanical field is being transmitted through the substrate, and the substrate is the network, right? So the deformation of the network is important because essentially you would like the cells to see each other and eventually to come together to form the tissue you want them to form. There is one more detail which you may be interested in. It has been relatively recently shown that if you take a stem cell and you put it on a hard substrate, it's going to become bone cells. If you put it on a soft substrate, it's going to become, let's say, neurons. Okay, so it's quite important what you put it on and the elasticity of that substrate. This is probably the most famous example of why fiber networks are important. What you see over here is a cell or family of cells in which the nuclei have been stained with a certain color. Then the microtubules, which are this network of really stiff molecular filaments that start from the nuclei and go towards the exterior of the cell, have been stained with another color, green. And then you have a background of red. That red is F-actin, which is another network, fiber network, made from this protein, actin, which basically just completely fills the cell, okay? The entire life of the cell actually happens within this network, okay? Now, think what is a tissue. A tissue is a cell of, are cells of these types, which themselves are fiber networks, embedded in larger scale networks made from collagen or elastin, okay? That is much larger fibers that form another network, larger scale network, which actually host the cells. So you can say maybe that life happens within, is harbored by fiber networks. So essentially organisms are made from fiber networks, water, and proteins. Of course, grossly exaggerating, okay? So why mechanics of all these fiber networks? Because fiber networks in most instances play the role of structural elements, like this. Right? So mechanics is important. So let's look at it. All right. Now, you know the story of the spherical chicken, do you? So we have to analyze something. So let's talk about the spherical chicken now. So let's go to a model. So here is the problem we are interested in. Suppose you have a really dense network with many, many fibers, and they cross, they are bonded at each crossing site. Therefore, the number of segments is very, very large, maybe hundreds of millions of segments or more. Okay? You are interested in solving a boundary value problem, meaning you define some loads on the surface of the network, you define some displacements on the surface of the network, and you would like to find out what is the stress state and the strain state inside the network at some place. For example, why do you need that? In the case of a cytoskeleton, it is known that mechanical loading on the cellular membrane, applied on the cellular membrane, is actually controlling or determining, in fact, chemical processes happening inside the cell. Okay? What is the actual stress or load acting on cellular organelle, that is constituents of the cell, produced by this stimuli, by this mechanical stimuli acting on the outer surface of the cell? Okay? We can't really predict, and we cannot measure at this time. So how about using a computer model to predict that? Okay? So this is what we want to figure out. Before I show you that, in fact, that is not my main purpose in this presentation, I would like to tell you more physical facts about the formation of these structures. They are really interesting structures, and they have a set of peculiarities which I would like to underline. For example, suppose that you zoom in, you select a domain and you zoom into this domain. You see a structure like this, and then you keep zooming by selecting smaller and smaller domains. You pretty much see something that looks the same. Okay? That's a characteristic of a fractal object. All right? That is a self-similar structure which preserves its geometry as you zoom in. Okay. Fractal objects are very heterogeneous structures. We really don't know how to predict their overall, let's say, homogenized, so to speak, behavior. Okay. There have been some studies done on the fractality of these networks. I really don't want to get into that discussion because it's fairly specialized. But suffices to say that, in fact, the structure of these networks can be shown to have some fractal characteristics. Can we identify some parameters, some geometric parameters of this structure? Let me just introduce 3 of them. On one hand, I know that I deposit fibers of a certain length. So that length is L0, right, the fiber length. However, when I deposit them down, I place a crosslink at each crossing point. So I divide the fibers in segments. What is the length of this segment? Well, it follows a Poisson distribution, and the mean of that distribution is called LC. It turns out that this parameter, LC, is actually inversely proportional to the density of the network, that is total fiber length per unit area or per unit volume. Okay? So LC, mean segment length, is a geometric parameter, of course. It depends on the density as I described. LB is a different type of parameter. You notice that it's a ratio between the bending stiffness of fibers, EI, and the axial stiffness of fibers. So it basically tells me whether these fibers are actually stiff in bending or floppy in bending relative to their axial stiffness, okay? So in the following discussion, we are going to play with these 3 parameters to learn a little bit more about the physics of the formation of this material. Here is a really interesting result, and that tells quite a bit about the formation of these structures. It is a plot which has been constructed after running more than 80 types of networks with different types of parameters, L0, LC, and LB. And for each type, for each set of parameters, we are running more than 20 replicas just to get proper statistical averaging, statistical information about these networks. No doubt, when you change the parameters of the network, you are going to get different elastic moduli, right? So is the answer, that is the elasticity of these things, is going to be very, very sensitive to L0, LB, and LC. But if you are able to normalize the axis properly, you eventually get this master plot. So you basically collapse the data from 80 different configurations, 80 different sets of parameters to a master plot. This master plot tells you a lot about the mechanics of the object. So what does it tell us? All right. The vertical axis is a Young's modulus of the fiber normalized by density and LB squared. Horizontal axis is some combination of the parameters of my problem. Okay? You immediately observe that actually there are two regimes. This regime over here, which in this log-log plot, it's a straight line of slope 1, and this regime in which basically the modulus normalized in this way, it's insensitive to this parameter. Okay? So there are two regimes. There is a transition regime in between. What does it mean? It means that in this range, the modulus is proportional to the density, while in this range, that holds over 2 decades, or probably more than 2 decades. So in this range, the modulus is proportional to density to power 8, right? Rho times rho to power 7. So the stiffness of this material, it's extremely sensitive to density in this range, while is much less sensitive in that range. It tells me that an organism which has a fiber network as the main constituent, it's actually able to add a little bit of matter to the network and change its stiffness by an order of magnitude. Okay? So that's already some interesting observation over there. Some other observation. If we are in this regime, deformation is affine. If we are in this regime, deformation is highly non-affine. Affine is a deformation of an homogeneous body. If you take a plate which does not have any inclusions or holes and such, you stretch it with, let's say, a uniform field. Let's say you stretch it with epsilon 1, 1 at infinity. If you go to any place, to any point in this plate, you are going to get exactly the same type of strain. Okay? If, however, the plate is heterogeneous, you are going to get locally a completely different strain state than what you apply globally. Okay? So this second case is called non-affine deformation, and the first case is called affine. This physics I described simply tells us that if the network is really dense, that is rho is large, or the fibers are really stiff in bending, that is LB is large, when I'm moving to the right in this plot, my network behaves as an homogeneous body. While when the density is small or the fibers are really floppy in bending, my network behaves as a highly heterogeneous body. Okay? How about paper? Well, paper is this really dense thing, right? I'm talking about the office paper, okay? Paper is this really dense thing, right? So you have a very high density, large number of fibers per unit area. So you would expect that it's actually in this range. And it is in that range. These are experimental data for paper, okay? Horizontal axis is density of paper. So you would say that the fluffy paper that we use in the restroom is actually on this side of things, while the office paper is on that side of things. And you see the affine model is actually predicting that trend. Okay? Something else. How about the energy partition? That is, where do I store energy? How do these fibers deform when I'm in the affine range versus when I'm in the non-affine range? The plot here on top is actually the plot I showed you before in the previous slide. Modulus versus this parameter, which I described before. Okay? The lower plot actually shows partition of energy. Blue symbols correspond to energy stored in the bending modes of fibers, while the green symbols correspond to energy stored in the axial deformation modes of fibers. So you see what happens. At about the point where you shift from the non-affine to the affine, the energy is also shifting from the bending to the axial. Okay? Which means that if I'm in the affine range, I'm storing energy mostly in the axial, while if I'm in the non-affine range, I'm storing energy mostly in the bending. Okay? So it pretty much tells me how these fibers store energy, not how they deform, because I really don't know what type of load I apply on the scale of a single fiber, but how the energy is being stored. That may or may not tell you much, but I hope this one will tell you something. Here is a network realization, both on left and on the right. It's exactly the same network. On the left side, I use fibers which are really floppy in bending. Okay, so LB is small. On the right side, exactly the same network, the geometry is identical. I use fibers which are stiff in bending. The colors represent how do I store energy. Okay? So in this case, when fibers are floppy in bending, that is, I'm in the non-affine range, the network behaves like a really heterogeneous material. 15% of the fibers carry 95% of the energy. Most of them are blue. Okay? What do you expect if this material is deforming affinely? Well, affinely means, again, that locally I deform exactly the same as the strain I apply globally, which means that you would expect that 95% of the fibers carry 95% of the energy. Okay? That would be the perfectly affine situation. That's pretty much what you get on the right-hand side. All right? So the message I'm trying to give you is I'm not changing the geometry of the network. I'm just changing the nature of the fiber response, the type of fibers I'm using. And I'm able to actually change the network behavior completely. This is a really soft network. It deforms really heterogeneously. Very few fibers actually carry the load. But if I make the fiber stiff in bending, then most of the fibers are loaded, and this network behaves like an homogeneous continuum. So you see, to my knowledge, there is no material out there which actually, with whose physics and deformation behavior you can play to that extent. All right. Let me skip over some of this because time is running short, and show you something else. Let's go back just for a few minutes to the problem we started from. Can we solve boundary value problems on objects, defined on objects of this type? Okay. So again, I would like to figure out what is the stress, what are the stress and strain at some point within the body when I only know the boundary conditions. So one can think, based on the discussion we had, that you can actually map this to a continuum. So how about I use the plot I just described, and knowing the density, okay, and I divide the network into small pieces. For example, I divide the network into this small little squares, let's say elements, each one of these squares having a certain density of fibers in it, right? So if I know the density and LB for each one of these squares, I can use the curve I showed before to actually come up with the stiffness for each one of these squares. So in principle, I can map this to something like that, in which now the colors represent moduli, elastic moduli. And then maybe I can treat every single square as a finite element and solve a boundary value problem with a continuum model. Okay? And then problem is solved. Can I do that? Well, the answer is yes and no. So you may get a headache. All right. Why? This moduli, that is the map of elastic moduli I'm showing over here, are actually spatially correlated, meaning that the modulus at some site depends on the modulus at another site. Okay. I don't want to get into this really in the details of it, but this plot, both plots actually show spatial correlation functions of density and moduli. Horizontal axis is distance. So basically what these functions tell us is how correlated is the density at this site to the density at that site. That's what the left plot shows. And how correlated are the Young's moduli at the two sides? That's the right-hand side plot. And we learned that they are correlated. The correlations are power laws and such. So this has some implications on how we solve the boundary value problem with the finite element model, for example. Another headache, strong size effects. The moduli I'm computing are actually very much dependent on the boundary conditions and the size of the patch I'm considering. So if I wanna compute moduli which are size independent, I have to use really, really large models. Okay. So this shows, for example, this shows an example of that modulus of the network computed for various model sizes. Right? This is the model size, the size of this box divided by the fiber length. And you see that for small models, actually we get a very strong size effect. And we have to have models or domains which are as large as maybe 20 fiber lengths to actually make sure that we are in the convergence domain. What does that mean? In terms of this picture, it means that my squares over here must be at least 20 times the fiber length for me to be able to actually use this type of thinking. Okay? So it is possible, and in fact, we have developed a stochastic tools to address this type of problem and to handle the uncertainties and such and predict global response of the network, but let's not spend too much time on that. Some other result. This gets closer to biological networks. All right, we have been discussing so far about the network itself, but we know networks are actually not embedded in air in general. Rather, they are embedded into something else, like a gel-like structure or a matrix of some sort. Okay? The question is, does that matter? Is the network acting on the matrix and the matrix acting on the network in any specific way? How does that play a role in failure, right? For example, when you think about tissue deformation, essentially fiber network embedded in something, right, being stretched, at what point do you get to, you have to expect failure of the structure? So we are looking into this, and some other groups are looking into it as well. I just want to point to a feature which we came up with recently. It's very interesting in my opinion, so I want to share it with you. If you forget about the network and you deform just the matrix is an homogeneous material. So deformation is going to be affine, which means everywhere you look, you are going to see the global strain imposed. Now you put the network inside. The network doesn't want to deform affinely because it's an heterogeneous material. So this heterogeneity of the deformation of the network actually gets transmitted to the deformation of the matrix. In other words, the network is going to pull on the matrix in various ways, trying to break it. Okay? It turns out that you would expect failure to happen to start in the matrix, not in the network. Let's try to understand the plot on the left-hand side. we have looked at stresses just in the matrix, okay? And we plot here the probability density function for stresses in the matrix. I'm stretching the network in the horizontal direction just as shown in this plot, right? So I'm stretching it in x1, and I'm plotting sigma 1, 1. All right, if you don't have any network embedded, you would expect that the stress is sigma 1, 1 is whatever you apply in the far field. That is the PDF, the probability distribution function, is going to be a delta function, which is what this vertical green line is supposed to show. Okay, that's the network. That's the matrix without network. What happens with stresses in the matrix when you put the network in? You are going to get a distribution like, for example, the black one. So the first observation is, although you are stretching in the one direction, so your global stress is positive, right? You are actually getting stresses in the network, in the matrix, which are negative. So you see this tail extending to negative numbers, right? So you actually get compression while you stretch this way, okay? Well, maybe not that surprising because we know that this must be heterogeneous. So, okay, maybe it does happen, all right? But here is a more interesting result. The mean of this distribution, it's supposed to be the global stress I'm applying. But you see what happens with the mean here is shifting to the left. So it looks like the matrix is unloading. So how is that possible? Shouldn't I actually get sigma 1, 1, the stress I'm applying on the whole thing? Well, it turns out that there is another effect that kicks in, which we didn't expect, as follows. The network, think about how the network wants to deform. When you stretch it this way, it has a really large Poisson's ratio. So the network wants to squeeze, to get compressed, right? Now the network is actually embedded in the matrix. So when you, and the matrix has a much smaller Poisson's ratio. So when you pull, the network is actually squeezing the matrix. The matrix is expanding in the horizontal direction, the direction of the stretch, and is compensating, therefore, for the applied displacement in the horizontal direction. So you are effectively decreasing the mean stress in the matrix. This is why these PDFs actually shift to the left. Well, in practical terms, when you talk about failure, this doesn't account too much because you are getting a broad distribution function, which means that you are actually getting very large stresses, both positive and negative. And in terms of failures, those matter. Okay. So we can enjoy the result, right? Or some of it. Just a few words about a much more interesting system, which we really didn't study in detail. We are in the process of doing that. And in fact, in general, the literature is not that thick on this subject. Non-bonded network, entangled fibers, right? So you take a clump of fibers, bunch them together, right? They get entangled with each other. They are not bonded at all, but they interact frictionally with each other. And topologically, that is, they cannot cross. So when you pull, if you don't have any friction between fibers, they will just unravel eventually. But if you do have friction, of course, they will respond and store some energy. So we would like to understand the mechanics of this thing. How do these networks respond to load? So we put together computer models for this purpose, and we want to understand if non-cross-link networks are a completely different animal than bonded networks. And the answer is, you bet. All right. So I don't want to get into the details of it, but here is a quick comparison between non-cross-linked and cross-linked networks. On the left-hand side is the plot I showed you before. Modulus divided in some, normalized in some way versus the parameter I used before. You remember the two regimes, the affine regime in which stress is, or modulus in fact, is proportional to density, and the non-affine regime in which modulus is proportional to density to power 8. Okay? Now, here is how the non-bonded network responds to compression in this case. So I'm taking a box filled with fibers, non-bonded fibers, and I compress it, okay? And I plot stress versus strain, in particular pressure versus dilatation strain. And what you see is a very beautiful and long-range power law, which extends essentially over the whole range of loads from percolation, which means from the point when these fibers actually make contact with each other and start pushing back at you, to full compaction, which is this last point on the left. Okay, so very beautiful power law. But the exponent of this power law, that is the scaling of stress with density, this exponent m is about 4, while the other two exponents were 1 and 8 respectively. So one good news, one bad news. The good news is that both of them behave as power laws. The bad news is the exponents are not the same. Okay? Why is that? We don't know. Okay? And the last thing I want to show you, just to underline how complex this type of system may be, is this. So you start compressing this non-bonded network. And you look at, let's say, stress versus strain, or you look at the stability of the deformation in fact. Right? At the beginning, that is when the fibers just start coming into contact, everything is smooth. So I'm looking at stress, and you see stress versus strain is a relatively smooth curve, this range over here. Right? So I'm just trying to compress this thing. But when the density gets large enough, there is a threshold beyond which stress versus strain becomes this jagged curve. What happens? There is no friction. Okay? There are topological rearrangements inside the network. The network is actually just reorganizing as I deform. Okay? So it's another example of a material which has a structure which is basically just evolving during deformation. And any metal does that. Most polymers do this, okay? But this is just a demonstration that fiber networks can do it. So you have large rearrangements corresponding to relative sliding events of fibers and drops in stress. And of course, when you compress sufficiently, then this thing becomes smooth again because essentially the whole thing becomes a compacted material. So with this, we all, that is all people that have contributed to this work, my former student Hamed Hatami, current students Ali Shashvari and Lijuan Zhang, and my former postdoc, Gopinath Subramanian, we all thank you for your attention. And by the way, these guys too. Absolutely. Fiber networks behave quite differently in tension and compression. What I showed, the master plot I showed actually corresponds to small deformations. Yeah. And that's a linearized domain which is basically insensitive to the sign of the applied strain. When you get into large deformations, of course, they will do different things, yes.
Yeah, but you model it as if it's the same in both.
For small deformations, yes. Yeah. That is true, actually, for small deformations.
And that's true for both for both
affine and non-affine, yes. Right. Right. Well, you notice that the structure are actually inclined. So there are 2 degrees of freedom here. Actually, it can do this, which releases a little bit of that buckling tendency of the film, and it can also move horizontally. And in fact, there are results in the literature back in the, I believe, early or mid-90s, reporting that compliant layers deposited under strained films actually release the strain. So I think what we are seeing here is just a compliant layer, an example of compliant layer, but it's a compliant layer which also gives you a little bit of flexibility in this direction.
So the contact between the layer of these anchoring objects and the metal is just at the tip of the object.
Correct.
They're not submerged.
Correct.
Okay.
And they are made from the same material.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Okay.